They say silence is golden, a sign of wisdom, patience, self-control. But silence is not always what it seems. Sometimes silence is not peace. Sometimes it is protection. In a world that rewards constant talking, quick reactions, and endless expression, quiet people often stand out in uncomfortable ways. They are called distant, reserved, hard to read. But what if silence is not emptiness at all? What if the quietest person in the room is not disengaged, but deeply aware? Why do some people feel drained by noise but restored by quiet spaces? Why does conversation sometimes feel exhausting, while silence feels strangely comforting? For certain minds, silence becomes more than the absence of sound. It becomes a place where thoughts settle, where emotions breathe, where the world finally slows down enough to be understood. This quiet preference is rarely random. It often has a history, a psychology, and sometimes a story no one ever hears. Let's begin. Silence often begins quietly, not as a decision, not as a personality trait, just a small preference that slowly becomes noticeable. In a crowded room filled with overlapping conversations, there is often someone who simply listens, not because they have nothing to say, but because observing feels more natural than competing with the noise. While others rush to fill every pause with words, this person feels comfortable letting the pause exist. And gradually, a quiet realization begins to form. Silence feels better. Not empty, not lonely, just calmer. Because noise, for certain minds, can feel overwhelming. Too many voices, too many reactions, too many emotions moving through the air at once. So the mind steps back, not in rejection of people, but in search of clarity. In silence, thoughts settle. Emotions become easier to understand. The world slows down just enough for the mind to process what is happening. But the outside world rarely sees this inner experience. Instead, silence is often misunderstood. Why are you so quiet? Are you shy? Why don't you talk more? Questions like these appear again and again, quietly suggesting that something about silence must be wrong. But for many people, silence is not absence. It is attention, because while others remember the loudest moment in a room, the quiet observer often remembers something else entirely, the feeling of the room itself. And this is where the story of silence truly begins. Silence rarely appears suddenly. It grows slowly, like roots beneath the surface, forming long before anyone notices the tree. For many people who feel comfortable in silence, the story begins early, often in childhood, within the emotional environment where they first learned how to express themselves. Every child begins with the instinct to speak freely, asking questions, sharing thoughts without hesitation. But the responses they receive slowly shape their behavior. Sometimes a child speaks and is interrupted. Sometimes they share an idea and it is dismissed. Sometimes their feelings are met with confusion or criticism. These moments do not always seem serious, but repeated often enough, they quietly teach an important lesson. Words can carry consequences, so the mind begins to adapt. Instead of speaking immediately, the child learns to observe first, to watch reactions, to sense the mood of the room before saying anything at all. Gradually, expression becomes more cautious, and silence begins to feel safer, not because there is nothing to say, but because observation feels more reliable than reaction. Over time, this quiet awareness grows into something deeper, an ability to notice emotional atmospheres, subtle tensions, and the small signals people often overlook. From the outside, it simply appears as quietness. But underneath, it is something else entirely. A mind that learned to understand the world by listening first. Silence does something unusual to the mind. When words slow down, awareness often expands. In a noisy world, attention is constantly pulled outward. Conversations move quickly, opinions collide, reactions appear before thoughts have time to settle. But when someone spends long periods in quiet observation, a different mental rhythm begins to develop. The mind learns to notice, not just what people say, but how they say it. A slight pause before an answer, a forced smile that lingers a second too long, the subtle shift in tone when someone mentions a sensitive subject. These signals are small, almost invisible, but to an observing mind, they are everywhere. Because when speaking less becomes a habit, listening naturally becomes stronger. Psychologists often describe this as deep processing. Some individuals simply take in more information before responding. Their thoughts move slowly through layers of reflection, emotion, and context before forming a conclusion. This process can look like hesitation from the outside, but internally, something much more complex is happening. Imagine standing beside a river. Some people throw stones quickly, watching the splash before reaching for another. Their reactions are immediate, spontaneous, constantly moving. But the observing mind behaves differently. Instead of throwing stones, it watches the current. It studies the way the water moves around obstacles, how the surface reflects the sky, how the flow quietly changes direction over time. This kind of attention requires stillness, and silence provides that stillness. Inside quiet moments, thoughts settle like sediment sinking to the bottom of a lake. What once looked cloudy becomes clear. Patterns begin to reveal themselves. Why did that person react so strongly? Why did the atmosphere in the room suddenly shift? These questions often appear naturally in reflective minds. Not out of judgment, but curiosity. Because observation creates distance from immediate reaction. Instead of speaking quickly, the mind pauses. Instead of responding impulsively, it considers possibilities. This habit slowly strengthens emotional awareness. A quiet person may walk into a room and feel the tension before anyone acknowledges it. They may notice discomfort in someone's posture long before the conversation turns serious. These abilities often appear mysterious to others. How did you notice that? Someone might ask. But the answer is simple. They were paying attention, and silence gave them the space to do so. Of course, this kind of awareness can be both a gift and a burden. Seeing emotional undercurrents everywhere means the world can feel heavier at times. Every room carries information. Every conversation holds layers beneath the surface. But it also creates something remarkable, a depth of understanding that does not rely on constant speech. Because sometimes the most accurate picture of reality appears not through the loudest voice in the room, but through the quietest observer. And within that observer, an entire internal world begins to grow. A world filled with reflection, imagination, and meaning. One that few people ever see. From the outside, silence often looks simple. A quiet person sitting calmly in a room, listening, watching, speaking only when necessary. But inside, the experience can be anything but simple. Because silence does not mean the mind is empty. For many people who feel comfortable in quiet spaces, the internal world is incredibly active. A place filled with thoughts, reflections, questions, memories, and emotions moving gently beneath the surface. While conversations rise and fade around them, their mind may be tracing connections between ideas, revisiting something that was said earlier, or quietly observing the emotional atmosphere of the room. It is a different kind of engagement, less visible, but often deeper. In silence, imagination also has room to breathe. Thoughts stretch further without interruption. Ideas grow slowly, like vines climbing toward light. Moments that others forget quickly may linger longer inside the reflective mind. A simple conversation from the afternoon may return later in the evening, examined from different angles. Why did that person sound uncertain? Was something left unsaid? Did a certain word carry more meaning than it first appeared? These quiet reflections are not signs of overthinking as much as they are signs of a mind that values understanding. Silence allows time to process emotions fully rather than reacting immediately. Time to explore ideas rather than dismissing them too quickly. And within this mental space, a rich internal landscape often forms. A landscape shaped by memory, empathy, imagination, and curiosity. Some quiet individuals describe this inner world almost like a private library. Shelves filled with observations gathered from years of watching how people behave, how emotions move, how conversations reveal hidden truths. Others experience it more like a calm ocean beneath the surface of daily life. The waves on top may be quiet, but deep below, powerful currents are constantly moving. Yet because this world exists internally, it often remains invisible to others. People tend to judge engagement by visible energy, by words spoken, laughter shared, or stories told loudly across the table. So when someone sits quietly, observers sometimes assume nothing much is happening. But silence rarely means absence. It often means processing, feeling, reflecting. In fact, many quiet individuals speak most clearly when they finally decide to share something important. Because by the time words leave their mouth, the thought behind them has already traveled through layers of reflection. It has been shaped carefully, tested against emotion, considered from multiple perspectives. And this process can create something powerful, a kind of speech that carries weight, precisely because it is not used casually. Still, this hidden depth creates an unusual contradiction. Inside, there may be an entire universe of thought and feeling, but outside, the world only sees stillness. And this gap between inner richness and outer perception often leads to one of the most difficult experiences quiet people face: being misunderstood. Silence is often misunderstood. In many social spaces, words are treated as proof of presence. The more someone speaks, the more engaged they appear. The more they react, the more connected they seem. So when someone remains quiet for long stretches of time, people naturally begin to wonder. Are they bored? Are they upset? Do they dislike the conversation? Or the people around them? Sometimes the assumptions become even sharper. Quiet individuals may be described as distant, cold, unfriendly. In certain situations, they may even be labeled arrogant, as if their silence means they believe themselves above the conversation. But these interpretations rarely reflect what is actually happening, because silence, for many people, is not about withdrawal from others. It is simply the way their mind moves through the world. While others express themselves outwardly, their attention often turns inward first, examining emotions, observing social dynamics, reflecting before reacting. Yet the social world often moves quickly. Conversations jump rapidly from one topic to another. People interrupt one another playfully. Stories overlap. And in this environment, the reflective mind sometimes struggles to keep pace. Not because it cannot respond, but because it prefers to respond with intention rather than speed. So the quiet person pauses. And that pause, in fast-moving conversations, can easily be mistaken for distance. Over time, these misunderstandings can create a subtle emotional tension. The quiet individual may begin to notice that their natural rhythm does not always fit comfortably into certain social expectations. They may sense that others feel uneasy around long moments of silence. So sometimes they try to fill the space, offering quick replies, forcing conversation that does not quite feel natural. But these efforts often feel draining, because speaking without reflection can feel like abandoning the very process that makes communication meaningful to them. So eventually, many quiet individuals return to the place that feels most authentic. Silence, not as rejection, not as indifference, but as honesty. And yet, the repeated experience of being misunderstood can still leave a quiet ache. Because the desire for connection does not disappear simply because someone enjoys quiet spaces. They may still long for conversations that move slowly, where pauses are not awkward, where listening carries the same value as speaking. Moments where silence is not treated as a problem that needs to be fixed, but as part of the rhythm of genuine understanding. Unfortunately, these spaces are rare in a world that often fears quiet. And so many quiet individuals spend years believing that something about their nature must be wrong, that their silence is a flaw to overcome. But eventually, for some, a quiet realization begins to emerge. Perhaps silence was never the problem. Perhaps the problem was misunderstanding what silence truly means. For a long time, silence can feel like something that needs to be explained. A quiet person may grow up hearing the same questions repeated over the years. Why are you so quiet? You should speak up more. You need to come out of your shell. At first, these words may plant a quiet doubt. Perhaps something really is missing. Perhaps confidence should sound louder. Perhaps silence is a weakness that needs to be corrected. So the quiet individual tries. They practice speaking more quickly in conversations. They force themselves into discussions before their thoughts have fully formed. They attempt to match the pace of a world that moves faster than their natural rhythm. But something often feels strange during these efforts. Not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar. Because the words may come faster, but the connection feels thinner. The mind has not had time to explore the thought fully. The emotion behind the statement feels unfinished. And gradually a realization begins to form. The discomfort does not come from silence itself. It comes from pretending that silence is unnatural. For some people, this turning point arrives through experience. Perhaps they encounter someone who appreciates their listening instead of questioning it. Someone who does not rush to fill every pause. Someone who treats quiet attention as a form of respect rather than absence. In moments like these, the quiet person begins to see their nature differently. Silence suddenly feels less like a flaw and more like a rhythm, a way of processing the world. And when they look back, patterns begin to reveal themselves. The years of observing people carefully, the ability to sense emotional shifts before they are spoken aloud, the habit of thinking deeply before offering an opinion. These qualities were never accidents. They were the natural results of a mind that values reflection. Slowly, the pressure to imitate louder personalities begins to soften. Not because the quiet person rejects conversation, but because they understand something important. Silence and expression do not need to compete. Both can exist together. Words can emerge when they carry meaning, and silence can remain when reflection is still unfolding. This realization often brings a quiet kind of relief. The constant effort to appear more talkative, more outwardly expressive, begins to fade. In its place, something steadier grows. Acceptance. The quiet individual begins to trust their natural pace of thought again. And once that trust appears, silence no longer feels like something that needs to be defended. It simply becomes part of who they are. Not emptiness, not withdrawal, just another language the mind uses to understand the world. And within that language, something powerful begins to reveal itself. Silence, when fully understood, can carry its own kind of strength. Silence is often mistaken for fragility. In a culture that celebrates bold voices and rapid opinions, strength is frequently associated with volume. The person who speaks first appears confident. The one who dominates the conversation appears powerful. But there is another form of strength that moves differently. Quieter, slower, less visible, yet deeply steady. For those who have spent years observing before speaking, silence becomes more than a habit. It becomes a foundation, because when someone listens carefully to the world for long enough, they begin to notice patterns others often miss. They see how emotions move beneath words, how conflict grows slowly before it finally erupts, how certain phrases can comfort, while others quietly wound. This kind of awareness develops gradually. Every conversation observed, every emotional shift noticed, every moment spent reflecting instead of reacting. All of it strengthens something subtle within the mind. Discernment, the ability to recognize when a moment truly requires words, and when silence holds greater meaning. Many quiet individuals speak less frequently, but when they do speak, their words often carry weight, because those words have already traveled through reflection. They have been examined from different perspectives, measured against emotion, allowed to settle before being shared. And because of this process, their voice can sometimes bring unexpected clarity to a situation. A single thoughtful sentence may reveal something others overlooked during hours of conversation. This is the quiet strength of reflection. Not the power of dominating a room, but the power of understanding it. Of course, this strength does not always feel powerful from the inside. There are still moments when silence feels misunderstood, when the quiet individual wonders whether they should say more, participate faster, react sooner. But over time, the deeper truth becomes harder to ignore. The world does not only need louder voices, it also needs careful listeners. People who notice the emotional currents beneath social interaction. People who pause long enough to consider the consequences of their words. People who value meaning more than noise, because conversation without reflection can easily become chaos. And sometimes the most stabilizing presence in a room is the person who speaks only when their words matter. Silence, in this sense, becomes something different than what it first appeared. It is not absence. It is presence expressed quietly, a form of awareness that does not compete for attention, yet shapes the emotional space around it. And when this strength is finally recognized, silence no longer feels like something to hide. It becomes something to understand, something to respect, something that carries its own quiet wisdom. And in the end, silence itself begins to speak a language that words alone cannot express. In a world that rarely stops talking, silence is often misunderstood. Many people see it as emptiness, pause that should be filled. But silence is rarely empty. For those who find comfort in it, silence is simply another way of being present. A slower rhythm of awareness. A place where thoughts settle and emotions have space to breathe. Not every mind moves outward first. Some minds turn inward, observing, reflecting, understanding before anything is spoken aloud. And for a long time, this difference can feel confusing. In a world that rewards constant expression, quiet individuals sometimes wonder if their silence means something is missing. But silence was never meant to compete with words. It gives meaning to them. Without stillness, conversation becomes noise. But with quiet space, words begin to carry depth. They arrive slowly, thoughtfully, and often with greater intention. And this is the quiet truth behind people who find comfort in silence. They are not disconnected from the world. They are listening to it deeply. Music. If this video made you feel seen, or if something quiet inside you was touched, know that many people share this same rhythm of reflection. You are not alone. If you'd like to stay connected, you're welcome to subscribe. This space simply explores the hidden corners of the human mind and heart. And if you feel comfortable, you may share your experience with silence in the comments. Your words might help someone else feel understood. Take care of yourself.